Mary, I'd like to kick off by asking our introductory question here, and that is, how have international students' expectations of teaching and learning changed since March of 2020?
When we did our COVID-19 impact survey in this fall, what we found was that 92% of institutions were teaching in a way that was unlike any other semester previously. And this was really providing an opportunity for them to explore different methods of instruction, different types of technology for instruction. And I think that on the institutional level, institutions really understood that there were new challenges to this type of instruction. In terms of international students showed a lot of interest in participating in classes virtually, even if they were located outside the US in the fall of 2020. So what we learned was that about 1 in 5 international students that were enrolled in US higher ed institutions during the fall were enrolled online from abroad. Okay, so if we think about that, what we also learned and what we what universities are learning and what we've learned from international students is that there were some really profound logistical and infrastructure challenges around virtual instruction, especially for students who were abroad. So when you think about synchronous instruction and time zones across time zones, that was a huge challenge. When you think about students accessing campus services across time zones, that is also a huge challenge. And then in addition, when we think about infrastructure and technology and bandwidth, that was also a major barrier to participation. Another factor, I think, is that, for students participating from abroad, in many places in the world, folks live in multi-generational households. So in terms of having the space and, sort of a quiet space to be able to concentrate was also continued to be a challenge. I think the great news around this is that in our most recent survey to universities, what we found was that institutions reported supporting international students with IT support as like their number one priority. About 84% of them were providing more IT support to international students than previously, so that they could help them overcome some of these barriers. And so I think what we'll find is that IT support services are even more critical, and institutions knew that they had to do more to support students in that area in order for them to be successful in their learning.
Yeah, I feel many of the sentiments you raise is kind of parallel to what we've experienced in our industry, and that is the travel restrictions and the inability for those international students to leave their home countries and have their feet on Western soils has really changed what they require, like from their courses, their lecturers, and what they're looking for, a blend of synchronous and asynchronous opportunities. It would pose a lot of challenges for somebody in the far eastern part of the world to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning to study classes. While it might maintain a little bit of quietness in their home, it does pose the challenges of being restrictive of their health and having to wake up at odd hours to study. So we've also witnessed those serious challenges with the timing differences between, when courses are being had online. And it also is difficult for an institution to then cater to the 4 corners of the world and the time zones to cater to everybody. So those challenges have also been raised. And then you get the opportunity where some of these students have those language barriers. So they're looking for more digital chatbots, digital ways of which they can communicate to their actual institutions or the support they get. It's always easy to go into a counselor's office or, to the student center and get the service offering, but they're looking for a way to kind of blend, the technology and the transformation that they're having to go through. And we weren't preparing themselves for these unique challenges. And then you cited a couple of items around internet issues. That then poses some challenges, the inability for some nations to allow Google access. So they're unable to actually access Google, or maybe some capital restrictions around security and firewalls.
Mhm.
These are things that these institutions haven't taken into consideration. And that does pose challenges for these students who choose to want to get the education, but are kind of having some capital control issues that are challenging both the technology and all the challenges that come with that.
Exactly. Yep.
So thanks for that. I'll lead into our next question here is, how do institutions ensure that the social, communicative, and collaborative aspect of international studies coexists with digital transformation?
Yeah, I think this is such a great question, because we know that, this sort of generation of students, they are, digital. The way that they interact with technology is totally different than many of us growing up. And so I think that the interesting thing about COVID-19, right, is that as technology, there will continue to be advances in technology. The bandwidth will continue to get better. The access will continue to get better if students are participating, from their homes around the world. However, I think that what we know now to be true is that being the sort of proximity to one another is also really critical and really important. And students have shared that. And so I think some of the interesting adaptations that have occurred during COVID-19 to really ensure that social and collaborative aspect is really around, universities setting up regional collaborative circles, having university settings in students' home countries where there is a critical mass, where they could come together, at specific times with safety protocols in place, and really, have that sort of identity of their U.S. institution in their home country when they're not able to actually be here in person. And so I think those kinds of things have really helped maintain sort of a sense of continuity, a sense of identity, a sense of just connection during this time where there's so much disruption in people's lives. And I think that actually some of these innovations, if you will, or some of these things that we've had to do because we haven't had a choice, will actually be really great models for moving forward into the future. As I don't think there's any kind of going back from hybrid and blended sort of modes, and so I do see the ability of like U.S. higher ed to meet the demands internationally. There might be more of these hybrid approaches where maybe you're in the U.S. for some of the time, or you're doing some of your work from your home country at a university hub in your region or in your country. So I think that the rapid acceleration that was posed by COVID-19, there are pain points, right, that we're seeing. And I think the great news is that we're seeing universities and the higher ed community really respond in creative ways to ensure that international students do continue to feel connected to their home institutions.
Complete agreement there, and just want to cite some things that we were hearing. I'll read a quote to you from Camille Rutherford, who's the Vice Provost International at Brock University in Canada, and she's come to surmise that learning is a social activity. This is one of the biggest gaps that we all took for granted. As you're walking out of your class, you bump into people. That's how you meet people, and you meet new friends, especially for international students. who may have feel that they're alone and don't have their siblings or their friend network or their family around them. It's that rubbing the shoulders environment. So I found that to be a bit of, we are now having to choose to look at the periphery than what was actually in front of us in the past, because this path to success is repeating what actually works. But knowing, the impact of these international students who actually don't have that network that they're familiar with is the requirement to meet their network through those happenstances of in the locker rooms or in the hallway cafeteria. So that was something that kind of brought some, openings, and having to have people force that pivot of, what are the downfalls of the students not getting that experience as part of their post-secondary education. And
Absolutely.
you also mentioned the idea that these U.S. schools are looking to actually feel a bit more ingrained in the fabric of these countries. And I'll talk to you about what Columbia University has done, and this is really taken right from their website, is they've actually created 9 global centers around the world. And it's a network to allow students to actually be in the same premises, of course, following health and safety protocols, but whether it's for that networking, the socializing, or maybe the limitation, as you mentioned earlier, it's hard if you have siblings or family members in a home, you can't do stuff, they're interrupting you. So maybe it's a space issue or connectivity to internet, or even access to hardware like a printer or items. So we know that Columbia University had to pivot and really look at, if they are not able to land here in the US, they're looking to deploy these kind of centers for them to actually have access to these, maybe whether it be the social aspect, once again, or just the inability to access the internet or, because of the challenges at home.
I guess the other thing I would say is as infrastructure and technology advances, I think that, we also might see some of these regional centers, some of the not needs, but some of the role that they play may also evolve beyond some of the sort of nuts and boltsy kinds of things that students need right now.
Yeah, it's tough. It's that mental health, that challenge where if those actually have arrived in the US and aren't able to go back home, but also not to be on premises, we've seen some cultural organizations kind of come and band together to lend support. One of which is the Chinese Students and Scholars Association. They're helping building a sense of community for Chinese students who might feel, they don't have that network, and they're trying that. I mean, it's really, really tough that a lot of these community centers and outreach centers are closed or have limitations of capacity. But you're still seeing these associations and these communities banding together to at least provide that level of comfort and knowledge. And there's another example, the SADS Girl Club that we know of is they created a digital space that brings young women together, just to talk about shared struggles and to help with their mental health, just to remove that stigma that they're not alone. So are you seeing that even for those students who maybe are on site in the US, that there are some outreach programs or community help that are allowing them to get around that mental struggle?
With all of the surveys that we did, from February, March, until, later this fall, what we've seen was that over 70% of institutions that we surveyed were providing international students with services around their health and well-being. And at the beginning of the pandemic, it was, mostly focused on students still in the U.S., but over time, it has expanded to support for international students who are, in their home countries as well. So I think that is a very positive development. The other, in terms of like the support around, anti-Asian racism, the xenophobia, at the time of our July survey, about 60% of institutions had released a written statement in support of international students on their campuses. And I wouldn't be surprised, if we were closer to 100% at this point. There were also things like the You Are Welcome Here campaign that, while it started, several years ago, those, was sort of ignited in light of everything that was happening in the U.S. and in the environment. To really show support for international students is being critical to, the fabric of our universities and to our communities. And going back to your point about like the sort of rubbing shoulders, international students and, being in a community where international students are, you're going to the grocery store with them, they're coming into your kids' schools to talk about where they come from. And, there are so many really, benefits beyond, the economics as well that, that we need as a society. And so I think that there has been really an outpouring of support to show international students that we do care about them. We do want them here. They are welcome here, and that they will continue to be welcome here. In terms of, addressing some of the financial impacts, what we've also found is with the advocacy piece, with the support of mental health, there's also been an outpouring of financial support. So, IIE, we have an emergency student fund, which we've had to support international students in the U.S. who, where there might be either, natural disasters or political crises going on, and, might be impacting their family's ability to support international students here in the U.S. or send money. And so we launched our emergency student fund campaign specifically for COVID this past year. And we were able to support more than 1,000 students with about $2 million in aid over the past year. And I know that many universities have actually also launched their own student emergency support funds, and Western Union Foundation, I know, has also generously supported a COVID-19 emergency response funds, and I know that your payment solutions actually help many universities disperse those funds to students. So I think that there has been a lot to help international students, I think, and to address some of their needs during this period. I think that there is certainly more to be done, and I think that as we sort of see a light at the end of the tunnel with the pandemic, I think it's kind of incumbent upon all of us to really look at how we can support the communities most impacted by COVID-19. And I think, part of that is like our international student community. And I think particularly, we know that in the higher ed space, BIPOC students, Latino students have had to step back from their educations at a higher rate than other students. And so I think a big question and something we should all be focusing on is how can we kind of redouble our efforts to make sure that those students who have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 have the supports that they need to get back to their university education, and how can we support them to be successful in that respect.
Yeah, you shared some really key messages throughout this call around the mental health, and then you translated that into the physical well-being, and then of course the financial impact. And what I wanted to kind of speak about is the financial impact is something that's been critically challenging for these students who, you mentioned, if they're not able to earn employment from working on campus, it means that they still have expenses, whether that be for meals or for shelter. And what we've been able to see is these same institutions, step up and provide relief payments and student efforts to make sure these students are well maintained, because if we're having these schools close down their campuses, and there's no access to capital, and of course, people are having some financial challenges throughout the COVID, which employment issues or so forth. I feel it was critical that the lessons learned is to accelerate the digitization of even financial instruments, where it would be easy for a student to go into a cashier's office and receive a check if they've dropped out of a course, and that check is in cash and they have access to currency. We've realized that the inability for the students to be on campus to collect those fundings had posed a challenge around access that student. All have access to their email, but we need to provide them these relief payments. And in addition to our philanthropic efforts to support through our Roof Foundation, we also had to pivot as an organization last year and almost pause our roadmap and simply we need to actually pivot to really understand this is now becoming more than just financial gains. It's actually, this is detrimental to the well-being of not only just international students, but domestic students who might be at school outside of states where you couldn't even cross states. So what has your analysis been around the impact of digitization, but also the financial impact of, we all know North Americans are probably laggers when it comes to the world of still using paper-based instruments as form of currency. And we know these international students are coming from regions where paper-based instruments aren't the norm. So facing the challenge of, why do I need to go to the cashier's office to pick up a check because I dropped a course where you can just, tap my phone deposit. So what's been your analysis around, the effect of digitization, but more on the transmission of the currency?
Yeah, well, I think it's been really interesting because whereas, when you think about like this fall, 1 in every 5 international students was studying from their home country, right? And I don't have stats around this in particular, but if we just think about, a large percentage of those students, they could be teaching assistants, they could be still working, for the university in a virtual capacity, or they could be graduate assistants, they could be getting financial support from the university. So when you think about that, I would posit to say there's probably been an unprecedented flow of funds going from U.S. higher ed institutions to other parts of the world. And so when I would think that when that happened, right, universities are looking at different ways to send those funds in both cost effective and ways that international students can easily access in their home country. And so, I think that it's probably been like a huge learning process in many ways, but also a good, again, going back to like sort of the rapid acceleration, like a rapid acceleration of like, yes, we can do this. We can use these non-paper based sort of methods of transactions in a very effective way. So, as I said, I don't have specific stats around that, but just if you think of 1 in 5 international students being in their home countries, that they, and also that university, I think the COVID response funds that universities made available were not just made available to international students in the US, they were made available to international students who were also studying in their home countries because they couldn't get to the US for whatever reason, but still needed that support. So I don't know if you're finding that kind of flow as well and seeing some of those changes.
We are an acceleration of refunds. Once again, those students who have that mindset of leaving home, studying in the US, and then part of that funding is for on campus and meal and so forth. So if they're now doing home learning in their home in digital, they're then having to get back a portion of their allocation towards on-site, meals and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the impact to the universities of we owe a portion of these funds back. How are we going to proceed with that challenge? Because
Mm-hmm.
we don't accept or receive the bank instructions of that student as part of their enrollment. So the challenge becomes, okay, we've received funding from you, but now we have a higher percentage of students that require a refund. And then that becomes a burden then on the accounting department to say, we now need to source banking information, or how do we get these funds back? We have access to US dollars, but these students might be in a world where US dollars is not the wanted currency, or they would prefer, to receive the currency back. So this has actually opened up the payables department, who typically worry about supplier and vendor payments, to now, is there a capacity issue, one, to manage that requirement because you're having to capture the banking information? Two, you've got your employees who are used to working on campus and have access to hardware like computers and laptops, who are now having to potentially work from home. So now
Mm-hmm.
overhead of capital cost. It's tiresome, but it's a need that needs to be managed in a short time window because of the requirement of access to that capital that the student or mom might have access to. So even through our own organizations, we've realized the impact has so many layers for institutions, from not only the receipt of students, but the impact of them not being able to be on site and the challenges that also poses. I always want to look at the light at the end of the tunnel here, kind of now with of course the increase of the vaccines and more vaccine, and hopefully we're starting to stabilize this pandemic. So how do these effects of the last year, 18 months, what does that mean for like a post-COVID world, and how are the institutions now needing to pivot to ensure that they're back to normalcy?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly we've learned a lot, and there's also a lot more to learn. And I think that, certainly at IAE, we're really hopeful that international student mobility will pick up again with this light at the end of the tunnel, and we're really committed to supporting that. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to ensure that, again, those students who were most impacted by COVID, those populations that are most vulnerable, receive the support that they need to continue their studies.
Just to lead on that, during our preliminary discussions, you had cited some numbers that impressed me, which is the impact these international students actually have on the U.S. economy, and how when they post-graduate, the startups. And I think it's it's something to really think about, because if those students are not leaving home countries and have more of that hybrid model, the U.S. impact of the economy, is it going to be challenged because they're not going to then do their post study work on I guess onshore as opposed to their home country?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, international students do, it is the fifth largest export, if you want to think about it in terms of an export to the U.S. So international students contribute about 44 billion to the U.S. economy, and about 500,000 jobs connected to them being here. And so, I think that there's going to continue to be an increase in U.S. higher education. I think that there's going to continue to be an increase in an interest in international students coming to the U.S. And then I think at the same time, there's going to be an even greater opportunity to reach even more students with some of these regional centers that you mentioned, and hybrid forms of learning and teaching. And so I remain again, like, really hopeful. And there's a great, going back to the stat you mentioned, there's a great piece of data from NAFSA around when they looked at sort of the top tech innovators, and I think about a quarter of them had come to the US as international students. And these are, companies that have a global footprint. And so, and I think, when we look at solutions, I think we're going to see many kinds of cross-border solutions that are going to take, again, sort of everyone playing a critical role. And so I think that international students are going to continue to be a huge part of the fabric of our higher ed institutions, and that there's a lot of possibility for different types of innovation around that.
Well, let's hope, Mary, because as humans, we are creatures of habit. And if we are getting through this, hopefully sooner than later, and we're back to in-class learnings, I think we cannot close our eyes to the impact of the last 18 months and the need to pivot, the need for digitization, the need to manage what are the impacts of international students not being able to study on campus. So maybe I'd like to maybe give you the last word, and maybe you can summarize any thoughts about, as we get out of, this period of, turmoil that we went through. What's the parting remark you'd like to maybe give for the audience?
Gosh, well, I agree, Rajiv, and it's been a really great conversation. I think that there's a lot to think about. I think there are lots of opportunities for U.S. higher education to continue to transform how we think about learning and how we think about engaging students across the globe. And so I hope that we, I hope that maybe we pick up some of the habits of the last year and keep those at the fore rather than reverting back to like pre-COVID. So I guess that would be my parting comment. So
well, let's just say hopefully change is good. And I do want to thank the Institute of International Education for the great insights and learnings. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Hi, Mary. It's nice to see you again. During the session, we had some questions come in from the audience. So I'd like to kick off maybe the first question. The question comes in, it says, the cultural experience that comes with studying internationally is that it seems very difficult to transfer into the digital sphere. What is your take on this aspect?
So thanks, Rajiv. I think we're still learning, and I think there is so much more to learn about this, about experiencing education across borders. I think that, as I mentioned in our conversation, the proximity piece is really important. Being immersed in a different culture, learning how to navigate in another culture. Those around you in that culture, learning about you and where you come from, all of those things are really important. And I think that we're just at the very beginning of exploring how to do that in different ways. And when we think about AI and augmented reality and the use of technology in doing some of these things, we are really right at the beginning of that. And so I would continue to encourage us to explore and find different ways of ensuring that cultural experience does come through. And I think that is happening in some cases. The other thing I would say is that I think that if students are online from abroad at a US institution, I do think that there's a lot that we can't discount about being in a US higher ed setting with respect to the way we develop our curriculum, the way we engage students. And I think that there continue to be developments in that space that really encourage more collaboration between students, thinking about what we do synchronously and what we do asynchronously, and how we really up the sort of value add during the synchronous times. And I think that during those times, there will continue to be innovation around ensuring that students are able to engage and bring their sort of full selves to the classroom, their cultural backgrounds and things of that nature. So I actually think that we're really just at the beginning of this process.
Thanks for that. I'm going to lead into our next question, which is, without the limitations of physical space, will institutions be able to and or be tempted to enroll additional international students?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I think actually it's incumbent on U.S. higher ed to think about enrolling greater numbers of students around the world and thinking more about these hybrid approaches as we sort of look at the young people that will be wanting a university education in the future. I think we need to look across the world at emerging markets, at markets where it's been more difficult for students to obtain a U.S. higher education by studying abroad. I think, it's incumbent upon governments, foundations, corporations, the private sector to really to really think about, how do we engage this university age population globally in ways that both takes advantage of mobility, physical mobility, and that also continues to take advantage of technology and technological advances. There will be, I think there are some stats around, there will be many more students who want a seat at a university by 2025 than universities currently have seats available. And I think this stat was pre-COVID. So, with the financial implications of COVID on higher ed, I feel like that number will grow, and the ability to reach a greater number of students in the world to address some of these global issues is really important, and technology will help us do that. So I think going back to some of the comments in the intro panel, I think that this will be an opportunity to also revisit some of the financial models and some of the ways that universities, their financial models are structured, and think about, how can we look at a university education, in another country that has the hallmarks of a U.S. that has the hallmark that is part of the U.S. higher ed system, and that maybe it's delivered in country, and then there's an opportunity to come to the U.S. for a shorter period of time, or there's a lot more research collaboration that's happening virtually.
Great. I think we might have time for one more question, if that's okay, Mary. This one comes in, it says, what are the opportunities for promoting diversity with online delivery?
I think that this is something we need to be conscious of all the time. Who is delivering? Who has the opportunity to deliver? Who has the opportunity to engage in conversation? How do we ensure that all students feel like they have an opportunity to engage in the conversation, whatever that may be? How do we ensure that learners who have different learning styles, have different needs, are able to engage in the conversation? So I think it's, diversity on many different levels, and there needs to be intentionality around how we address and plan for that and ensure that that can happen. So I don't think we can just say we want there to be diversity and it will happen. It needs to really be an intentional focus, and a focus that involves all of the stakeholders as well.
Mary, we're getting close to the end of our session here. Do you have time to answer one additional question?
Sure, sure.
Fantastic. This one says, when international students come to the USA, they're expecting to adapt to their new culture, food, language, cultural values, personal experiences, and friendships. How do we go about this with the new approach of online education?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I think there are lots of different ways that we're seeing where people are able to share these things. It may not be the same as sitting down to a meal. It may be showing a picture of a meal or cooking together at the same time. I think we're all experiencing this in our personal lives as well. I think there are lots of opportunities for sharing across cultures virtually. And I think, as I said, I think with technology advancing, with AI, with all of these different tools, it's going to be much easier to share some of those experiences. And again, it doesn't discount the value of being in person and having these very deep experiences. I think that not everyone is going to be able to do that. There are financial barriers. There are many barriers to this, and so the more that we can think about what are opportunities for creating understanding, creating greater cultural exchange in different ways, the world will be a better place because of that.
Thanks, Mary. It was really wonderful collaborating with you on this session.